Okay, thank you and good morning. It's great to be here. I'm not going to talk about patient advocacy because we have two people from the office, Steve Warren and Deb Miller, who are going to address that a little later on. And but I did want to talk about FDA, and I think hopefully coming right on the heels of Josh Sharfstein, this will kind of really mesh well with what he was saying and give you a good sense about FDA. And I thought I would start off by showing you where we sit in the federal government. Obviously, we're part of the executive branch. We're under the HHS, the Health and Human Services Department, and part of the Public Health Service. And FDA is one of the HHS agencies, and we're a regulatory agency. So we really have a very different mission than everybody else who is in this cadre of organizations as being the regulators rather than service providers. And the mission for FDA is that we're responsible for protecting the public health by assuring the safety, efficacy, and security of human and veterinary drugs, biological products, medical devices, the nation's food supply, cosmetics, and products that emit radiation. And added to that are tobacco products, more recently. It's also really important to talk about what FDA is not responsible for, and that is to develop drugs and devices. We do not do that. We don't run the clinical trials that lead to the development and the approval of drugs and devices. That's done by private entities and then brought to FDA. We don't regulate the practice of medicine, which is why there is off-label use. So FDA approves a product that is labeled for the intended use that was shown in a clinical trial to be effective for that population. Off-label use would be the practice of medicine. And we do not regulate the cost or the price of medicines. But we do regulate about $1 trillion worth of products, which account for about 20 cents of every consumer dollar spent in the United States. And there's a very broad range of products that we regulate. Medical devices from toothbrushes and tongue depressors to microwave ovens, which are radiation-emitting devices, medicines, vaccines, blood products, foods, veterinary drugs, all sorts of things, cosmetics that Americans depend upon. So who does all of this? FDA is divided up into 6 product-focused centers. We have the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, the Center for Biologic Evaluation and Research, the Center for Medical Devices and Radiological Health, the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, Center for Veterinary Medicine, and the Center for Tobacco Products. There's also the National Center for Toxicological Research, which looks at toxicology of drugs and other products that are used as part of drugs or biologics. We have a field staff that does inspections, compliance, enforcement, and criminal investigations. They're distributed throughout the country, but most of the people at FDA are on the campus, which is in Silver Spring, Maryland. And altogether, all told, there's about, I think about 6,600 staff at FDA. So going back to the roots, because I think it's really important to talk about where did FDA come from, what are the roots, and how did it evolve over time to be what it is and have the responsibility it has. We can go back to the turn of the last century. Harvey Wiley was the head of the Bureau of Chemistry at the Department of Agriculture. And an artifact of Harvey Wiley, who's considered the father of food and drug law, really, is that our budget is still through the Department of Agriculture rather than HHS, which I think is a very interesting small artifact going back to the turn of that century. And in those days that Harvey was looking at drugs and foods, he was concerned about the fact that there was no control whatsoever. And people were buying what are called patent medicines, and they could make any claim and contain anything or actually contain nothing. There were no rules that determined whether or not a drug was what it said it was, whether it was effective, and whether it was safe. And I threw in here the Good Housekeeping seal of approval, because after Harvey moved on from the Department of Agriculture, he went to Good Housekeeping magazine, where he developed the Good Housekeeping seal of approval, which is still around today. I look for it on every product. So The wake-up call back in the early 20th century, there were two publications. One was Collier's expose of patent medicine fraud, and Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. And I don't know if people have read The Jungle. It's a very famous book. It was really about the food industry and the meatpacking industry, which ironically, FDA does not regulate most meats. But that was still kind of at the heart of developing the Food and Drug Administration. What they had written was essentially that things were filthy, that drugs didn't work, that people were being harmed by the drugs that they were taking, that they were ineffective and yet toxic. So Congress moved in 1906 to create the Pure Food and Drug Act. And that was signed by Theodore Roosevelt. It prohibited interstate commerce of adulterated or misbranded foods or drugs. So there was some truth in labeling there, and that drugs needed to meet standards of strength and purity. And so there were some shortcomings to this rule, mostly that the burden to demonstrate that there was a danger related to the use of a food or to a drug was on the FDA, which at the time was not the FDA yet. It was still the Bureau of Chemistry. But the burden was on FDA to show that there was something wrong rather than on someone to show that this product worked or that it was healthy and wholesome. And there was no allowance for factory inspection, so nobody could really determine whether or not they were produced in a clean and healthy and wholesome environment. So regulatory changes, which is what I think is really the crux of this whole talk, usually are precipitated by tragedies and problems. Regulations at FDA don't come out of nowhere. People don't sit around thinking, how can we restrict things? How can we, make things more difficult? It's always in relation to some sort of problem that needs to be solved. So 1906 to 1938 saw a parade of disasters, but the primary one that I think moved Congress and the American public was the sulfanilamide disaster. So in 1937, sulfanilamide was a precursor. It's a sulfa drug, but it was used to treat infections. So essentially a precursor to the antibiotics. And it was really an amazing development. But it was very hard to dissolve. And for children, someone decided, there was a company in Tennessee who made sulfanilamide, that by dissolving the drug in diethylene glycol, which is essentially the same as antifreeze, which was sweet and easy to dissolve the drug in, you could get kids to eat this or drink this drug. There were 107 deaths that related to the use of sulfanilamide. The agency went out and really searched for every single bottle that had been produced of sulfanilamide and seized the product. But the agency didn't even have the authority to seize it based on the fact that people had died. They seized it on the basis of misbranding, because being an elixir, it needed to be dissolved in alcohol and not diethylene glycol. So really, it led to a lot of controversy about the safety of drugs, the quality of drugs, and it got people talking about should there be a lot more regulation. And FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, signed the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is still the act that we operate under today, and created for the first time the Food and Drug Administration. So drugs needed to be shown to be safe before marketing, and this act extended these rules to cosmetics and therapeutic devices. There needed to be adequate directions for use, that's drug labeling. There needed to be a complete list of ingredients for the first time, and there needed to be a new drug application, which in the very beginning was not done by FDA. FDA didn't review them. The American Medical Association actually did the reviews for FDA and then reported back. But it also authorized factory inspections. So there was federal oversight of how clean, how efficient, what kind of quality assurance did they have at the factory level. I thought this was just, there have been a lot of amendments to the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act over the years, but I thought an interesting one was 1951, the Durham-Humphrey Amendment. I don't know how many people here were born after 1951, but before 1951, there was not officially a prescription drug. So this act explicitly defined two specific categories for medications: prescription drugs or legend drugs, or over-the-counter drugs. So it required that any habit-forming or potentially harmful drugs be dispensed under the supervision of a health practitioner as a prescription drug and carry the statement, which it still does, "Caution, federal law prohibits dispensing without a prescription." So this act really put what is considered to be a learned intermediary between the doctor and between the patient and the drug, so that people wouldn't just diagnose themselves, take these drugs, which were really pretty positive but pretty toxic as well. You needed somebody to make sure you knew what you were doing, that you weren't being overdosed. And I think it's quite a testament that this is still in play today. But what about effectiveness? So in the late 1950s and into the early 60s, a drug called thalidomide really established what FDA is today. And it brought to the forefront the importance of efficacy in drug development as well. So this was a drug that was essentially a sedative. They found it was very effective for women who were pregnant. It was great for morning sickness, and it was being given. It was approved in Europe. It was approved in Canada. It was being given in the US as an investigational drug, as samples, but it wasn't approved here. So there were tens of thousands of kids in Europe and in Canada who were affected by this. There were gross deformities, depending on when women took it during pregnancy, but it's a very teratogenic drug and affects the development of limbs. In addition to the tens of thousands of kids who were affected, there were a lot who were never born because it caused deaths in the womb as well. But it sure raised a lot of support in the United States for people to say drugs need to be effective before you're exposed to these toxicities. And Frances Kelsey, who only recently died well into her 90s a few weeks ago, probably about a month ago, is a very famous name at FDA and actually has an asteroid that is named after her somewhere out there in the ether. But she was the medical officer, new at the time at FDA, who wouldn't allow that to go forward because she had so many concerns about potential safety. And she was the person who really inspired the 1962 Kefauver-Harris Amendment, because it gave a lot of gravitas to the question about efficacy and safety and how the two go together. So these 1962 amendments to the Act required proof of efficacy. Drug manufacturers were required to demonstrate the efficacy prior to marketing. That didn't happen for medical devices until 1976, if you can believe that, because I'm sure most people here, or many people here, might have been alive then. And it required that manufacturers were reporting adverse events to FDA. This was really the birth of the modern clinical trial, because before that, the way that things worked was doctors would introduce a drug into the market, the way thalidomide was in the US, with samples that would be given out. The company would collect some information about adverse events, and then they would say, well, this looks relatively safe, and it might be approved. So food and drug regulation, I think the whole paradigm of food drug regulation is this fine line that the agency walks between regulation, policy, and science. And I think that's what Josh was talking about and getting at, is this fine line that the agency walks. So how does FDA's jurisdiction get established? And it is established in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and all of the amendments that have happened since. And so our authority comes from Congress. All of our authorities come from Congress, and so do the limitations on our authority. But in Congress, these laws are usually very broad strokes, and they're frequently unclear because they are so broad. So what FDA does is take those laws, and then we write regulations. And those go in the Code of Federal Regulations. For FDA, it's Chapter 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations. And we write implementing regulations. So it interprets the law at a more detailed level. And this is a very extensive administrative process. And Josh was talking about how long it takes for guidances and regulations to be written. There needs to be a notice of comment in any rulemaking. So we put out a proposal in the Code of Federal Regulations and says, we want to have this regulation, this is what it's going to say, this is what our thinking is behind the regulation and how we're interpreting the law. Then there's the Paperwork Reduction Act that says the agency has a budget of how much burden we can put on the public to collect information. And the public includes industry as well as anybody else. So if you're collecting information to support your application, that has to come out of our limited budget for paperwork Reduction Act purposes. And then there needs to be an economic analysis. So what's going to be the economic impact of this regulation on industry and the American economy? So all those things have to be done. They have to be calculated. You put it out for comment. You wait for the comments to come back, usually 60 days, 120 days, whatever the, would be justified by the complicated, the complexity of the proposal. But once those our comments are back, FDA has to address all of those comments. So that's why it takes sometimes years for a regulation to get onto the books. There's just a lot of work that needs to go into it, and a lot of thought that goes into how do we interpret the law to keep it broad enough so that circumstances that we don't foresee in the future can still be covered by these regulations. So once established, those regulations carry the force of law because they are based on the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Then FDA makes a series of regulatory decisions that are based on those laws and regulations, and those establish our regulatory policy. Those can be challenged in court, and very often they are. So there are lots of cases that are brought against FDA saying, you guys don't have the jurisdiction or the authority to require this or to require that or to take this kind of action. So the court rulings add to the case law. And then the regulations that result, sometimes there are changes to those regulations based on those court cases. Those establish the framework within which drug regulation operates on a day-to-day basis. And with luck, industry, FDA, consumers, everybody gets along and says, here are the ground rules. So FDA can't make ad hoc or one-off decisions based on how we feel about a particular matter. Decisions have to be fair and consistent, not arbitrary and capricious. They have to be made within the policy framework. And this is a very complex regulatory world. So the devil, as they say, is in the details. And I was working for a long time on that one. So, I think everybody at FDA realizes that you need more detailed interpretation of some of these regulations, but you need that flexibility. You try to get into the regulations that cause the confusion in the first place. And you need it to be able to evolve with science and technology as you're creating this regulatory framework. So guidance documents interpret the regulations that are interpreting the law. They're not binding. They don't have the force of law. They explain the reasoning and the general approach that FDA thinks companies or sponsors should be taking in developing a product, and they give details of how that should be done. But they're not binding. So what they tell you is the regulations say this should be the outcome. Here's what we think are the best ways to get to that outcome. But if you've got another way to do it that you think can reach the same outcome, make your argument. We're happy to, to listen to it. And even if the agency's not happy with that approach, a company can go ahead anyway. We don't have authority to require that people follow these guidances. They may come in at the end, and then FDA will say, well, we said you needed this outcome and you don't have it. But the guidance does not have the force of law. But the guidances make the policies and the technical advice that FDA develops and the thinking available to everybody so that there's presumably a level playing field. And so before I mentioned interstate commerce, and I think this is a really important point, because the authority that FDA have is based in interstate commerce. So how does the FD&C Act define interstate commerce? It's commerce between any state or territory and any place outside thereof, and commerce within the District of Columbia or within any territory not organized by a legislative body. So it doesn't just mean from New York to New Jersey is interstate commerce. It also means from Taiwan to New York is interstate commerce. And then the law applies to components and packaging as well as to the finished product. So if a product is produced in Wyoming and then sold in Wyoming, most people would think that doesn't involve interstate commerce. But in fact, if the raw product came from Montana, went to Wyoming, and then was put together, it's interstate commerce, and FDA would have jurisdiction over it. So it's a pretty far-reaching law that tries to ensure that people around the country are protected under the provisions of the Act. So, over the years, people have charged FDA with being much too slow. It takes too long to get drugs to market. There have been a lot of efforts to try and speed access to important new therapies. And I think very successfully, fast track, breakthrough therapy, accelerated approval, and priority review have helped move things through the process more quickly. And I just wanted to go through these really quickly. If people have questions, I'm happy to talk about it. But fast track can shorten the IND, which is the investigational stage, and thus the overall development time. But it facilitates and expedites the review of drugs to treat a broad range of serious conditions and fill unmet medical needs. And it provides for a lot more consultation between FDA and the sponsor. And believe me, that can make a very big difference in development, because FDA will consult on, do we think these are the right endpoints? What's the best way to measure them? How many people do you need to have in a study of this type, depending on what disease it is, how big the population is that's affected by the disease? What kind of endpoints are you going to look at? Does FDA agree that those endpoints are valid, that they're reasonable, and how are you going to measure them? So those kind of things are very important, because if you come into FDA at the end of the process and you haven't answered these questions, FDA is going to say, we're not going to file this application because you guys didn't meet an endpoint that was meaningful. More recently has been something called breakthrough therapy. These are products that are for serious diseases where there's a substantial improvement over current therapy. And that can be something that works better, but it could also be something that's easier to take, so people are much more likely to continue on their therapy and get benefit. It might be putting two drugs together so that instead of having to remember to take two different drugs during the day at a certain time, you can take one drug once a day. This happened a lot with HIV, and definitely improve outcome for patients. So breakthrough therapy essentially does the same thing by giving companies a lot of consultation along the way. Accelerated approval also is something that came about through the AIDS epidemic, and was something that I think came from the AIDS community itself. And it shortens the IND, or the study phase of a trial, because it can take a very long time. It can take years to see if there's a clinically meaningful outcome. It might be survival, overall survival. So for certain diseases, that can take many, many years to see if there's a difference between a control arm and the test arm. What the AIDS activists were onto was, why not look at surrogate markers that can predict an outcome even if they themselves are not indicative of the outcome? So FDA adopted that with HIV, and we started looking at viral load and CD4 counts, because those were starting to become validated as indicators of how long people would survive. The problem that people in the HIV community saw was FDA was waiting for people to die in order to show that this drug worked. So why, if you can predict it, would you wait until those people died? If the drug is showing promise, give it to everybody who's in the trial. And that made a lot of sense. So accelerated approval has been used quite a bit. It's very common in viral diseases, also in cancer and in other areas. And I think a sort of a triumph is that in HIV, there had been a 24-week viral load CD4 cell standard. And once you showed that, the drug hit the market, but the sponsor was required to continue for another 24 weeks, so 48 weeks of total data. FDA found that in every single case, the 48-week data showed a durable viral suppression. So the agency said, why don't we just accept the 24-week viral suppression as the endpoint? So it's not even accelerated approval anymore. It's full-scale approval. And priority review is after the IND, or the study clinical trial phase, a product comes to FDA, and I'll talk a little bit about this in an upcoming slide, but the priority review can shorten the time of FDA's review of the clinical data. And it does that by focusing priority and resources on that review, of allowing rolling reviews to come in so that as a sponsor develops their data, they send it into FDA, not waiting until the full package is put together. And the whole process can start rolling as the trial is ongoing. So under the PDUFA regulations, or the PDUFA laws, FDA has a standard review time of 10 months as a goal for action on an application, but a priority review is 6 months. And it directs attention and resources to the evaluation of applications. And I think, it's applicable where you have a significant change in effectiveness, diagnosis, prevention, serious illnesses, compared to standard applications. And it can be used in a number of different settings, including increased effectiveness, prevention, diagnosis, elimination or substantial reduction of treatment-limited drug reaction, documented enhancement of patient compliance, again, making it easier or more efficient to take a drug, and evidence of safety and effectiveness in a new subpopulation. So that might be going from an adult population, for example, to a pediatric population. And I think that these are, they were intended to make therapeutically important drugs available sooner without, this is what I think is the important part, without compromising the standards for safety and effectiveness of drugs for patients with serious illnesses. And that's what Josh was talking about before, that all of the activities at FDA, when you're looking at how can you speed these processes up, you don't want to compromise what is really the core issue, which is the safety and effectiveness. So you want to make sure that those studies are still valid, that they're well controlled, that they're of a size, and with endpoints that you can really analyze and come up with safety and effectiveness data. So safety is the risks are managed related to the drug, because none of the drugs are without any risk. All drugs have some kind of side effect related to them. The quality is assured from batch to batch and for each drug that comes out of the line. The advertising is appropriate, that they're not making unrealistic claims that were not shown in the clinical trial. And that's, the advertising is determined by the label, and the label is based on the clinical trial outcome. And that information is available, and that is the label. So people know, how do I use the drug? What's the proper dosing? What are the potential side effects? What should I be looking for? Are there ways to mitigate those side effects? On the effectiveness side, were drugs studied with proper endpoints and adhering to proper standards for clinical trials? Did they demonstrate an effect for the intended use in the intended population? So when you look at a label, it'll say, this is approved for use in adults from this age to that age. That's because that's who it was tested in. So that's the only place that FDA has real evidence that the drug works the way it was intended. And so the label also determines how it will be advertised, and so they can't say, you can use this in children. And it also guarantees that the quality of the drug will be maintained on a manufacturing level. So what does safety and effectiveness really mean? Because I think there are new paradigms, and this question keeps on moving. And one of the things that patient-focused drug development is trying to get at is, how much does the public feel, or how does the public feel about risk? The agency has been accused of being very paternalistic because the agency is determining how much risk patients are willing to accept. How much risk are patients willing to tolerate in return for a particular benefit? So you need to figure out, well, what are the benefits, what are the potential risks, and how are you going to balance that? And do user actions raise the level of risk? How people use the drug, at what stage of disease, all that is going to change how much tolerance people have for risk, and whether or not they use them according to the label is going to change the ratio of risk that they have related to the use of the drug. How are you going to let people know that at an early stage of disease where people don't want to accept that level of toxicity, that here's the level of toxicity, but people at the other end of a spectrum of disease might be very willing to accept the risks that are available or that are inherent in the product because they're going to get a benefit which for them is worth a lot more. So there are sometimes labeling approaches to REMS, and sometimes when a drug is particularly toxic, there might be limitations on who can get it, the chain of availability through pharmacists, through doctors. There's a whole range of ways that FDA is trying to control the flow of the drug to patients so that people understand what the risks are and can make their decisions based on that. So patient-focused drug development is one of those ways that the agency has been trying to do that. This was under PDUFA 5, and it aimed to systematically gather perspectives on people's conditions. What drugs are they using? What kind of benefits are they getting? So what are they willing to accept in exchange for a particular benefit? And so I think one of the things that's important about this is FDA operates on evidence-based medicine and clinical trials. You get very fixed data. So you know where it is on the meter, on the meter of safety and effectiveness. But what are people willing to accept? That's the judgment value that shows at what point in that needle flow are people willing to accept this amount of benefit and this amount of risk. So the patient-focused drug development gives FDA at least some feedback and input from what's important to people in terms of the clinical outcome and what risk they are willing to tolerate. I think that the benefit of the patient-focused drug development and programs like it is really down the line, because this information is coming into FDA. There's already clinical trials in play. Those are not going to change. But based on the outcome of these discussions, the FDA is there and industry is in the room with all these patients listening to this information. Everybody's very much aware of what it is that's important as an outcome for patients. And for industry, that's marketing benefit. For FDA, it's safety and effectiveness benefit. And I think everybody's going to start talking as clinical trials start to come up now about these are the endpoints that are really important to people. So investigational drugs, I just want to mention that every drug that's investigational in the United States, before it can be entered into a human being, it needs to go have oversight by FDA and go through what's called an investigational new drug application. And this is an exemption from the prohibition in the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act that an unapproved drug cannot travel in interstate commerce. But you need to be able to ship your drug in interstate commerce in order to study it. So there's an exemption from that rule, and that's the investigational new drug application exemption. We get about 1,800 new INDs a year, and these applications stay on file for a long time. So I think right now we've got about 12,000 current active INDs, and about 5,000 reviews or actions on INDs are taken every year. So that is a lot of work. The investigational new drug application is a requirement that a sponsor has to submit. What's the chemical composition, what animal drugs have been done, what were the outcomes, so you know how safe is it, what should you be looking for in terms of toxicity, how should you dose it, how much were animals in 2 different species able to tolerate before having toxic outcomes. How would you assure the safety, what kind of range of possible doses are you going to be using in your trial? What are you trying to show? What's the outcome and the effectiveness measure? How long should a clinical trial be? Because you need to get some sort of long-term outcome if you're going to be taking drugs for chronic illness, for example. So you don't want to run a 6-week study for something that people are going to be taking possibly for years or decades. What will you compare the drug to, and what study endpoints? And I think that's really important, because you've got to compare the drug to something to tell whether or not it has a comparative effectiveness. So there are placebo-controlled trials, but those are actually a lot more rare than people think. And most drugs are compared to existing standards of care to show whether or not a new drug adds something or improves the outcome. And there are multiple points of interface between FDA and the industry sponsor. Every clinical trial is addressed in detail at the review divisions at FDA. People look for careful, well-designed trials in the development program that are going to lead to a positive outcome. And the goal is always to establish a safety profile and determine what the efficacy is. So what's so important there is what are the endpoints that are going to demonstrate that efficacy and how much risk is tolerable to be balanced against those potential benefits. So in the new drug application area, we get about 200 to 300 new applications a year. Not all of them are for brand new drugs. Some of them are for uses that are for drugs that are already marketed, but they might be for new uses, new indications, new populations, like I said, with pediatrics, for example. So there's about an average of 25 to 30 new drugs that are approved every year at FDA, and about 250 to 350 generic drugs. Those are approved under a slightly different system. That's an ANDA, or an abbreviated new drug application. There's a lot of work related to that. And I just quickly wasn't sure how interested people were in the process, but generally you have animal studies before you go into humans. You have an institutional review board that's required to review a study to make sure it's ethical and scientifically sound before it goes to FDA and is conducted. Phase 1 trials, people think those are safety studies. Those are very basic safety studies when you're looking at how is the drug metabolized, how is it excreted, and what's the toxicity. And so it's used basically to figure out the dose. Phase 2 includes more people, still a relatively small number, but you're looking more now at the safety, now that you've got an established dose, and see if there is some efficacy to be seen in the Phase 2 study before moving to Phase 3. And generally, at the beginnings and ends of these meetings, sponsors come in and they meet with FDA to make sure that everything is on track and that things are moving in the right direction and there's nothing wrong with the trial. Phase 3 are the much larger trials, so they can include hundreds of people, they can include thousands of people or tens of thousands of people, and they can go on for months, they can go on for years, depending on the trial. So the darker lines are really the places where FDA gets involved in the development process. All the white background is essentially happening at the sponsor. But one of the other points that I wanted to make is that FDA continues after marketing to follow the drug. And on this, I included expanded access treatment INDs. These are ways for people to get access to an investigational drug outside of the clinical trial if they're not eligible for the trial. So that can happen at different points along the way. And also tried to show where a fast track and priority review would come in. And who does the work of reviewing this? This is the primary review teams are the people at the review division level. There are physicians, chemists, pharmacologists, toxicologists, statisticians, microbiologists, clinical pharmacologists, safety experts, plant inspectors, and other people who are looking at different aspects of the application and the study to make sure that things are accurate, that they're meaningful. They analyze the IND reviews. I mean, they review the IND for the clinical trial. They also look at the NDA, make sure that the study was applicable to what people were showing as an outcome. And they answer questions about, is it reasonably safe to study the investigational drug in humans when you're looking at the IND phase? Was the drug shown to be safe and effective for its proposed use, and do the benefits actually outweigh the risk of the drug? Is proposed labeling appropriate, and should it contain additional information to give people warnings about potential toxicities? And also look at to make sure manufacturing and quality controls are in place. And I think FDA is unique in the world in that FDA reviews the raw data. Most countries use data that's submitted by the company after they do the analysis. FDA looks at the raw data to validate and verify that data. And FDA also often seeks public advisory input. And that is an opportunity for everybody to come to this meeting and see what the process is. And I think this is the most transparent part of the process, because it's usually the only place that people get an opportunity to see the data and understand the calculations that went into the drug approval. But And it's also an opportunity for the public to speak at the open public meeting and give their input to the decision-making process. But the ultimate decision is made by FDA. And finally, once on the market, FDA still maintains oversight. There is adverse event reporting. The company is required by law to submit at least annually their adverse event reports. There's a voluntary MedWatch reporting system that doctors and patients can use to submit data to FDA about adverse events. FDA is piloting a Sentinel program to try and collect safety data from databases such as insurance companies who collect information about the interrelationship of the use of drugs and side effects. And FDA monitors the marketing and advertising and manufacturing and enforcement. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and if you have questions, I'm very happy to entertain. And I see my evil twin is looking at his watch, so I must be over. Yes? Okay.
Two questions, actually. One's kind of quirky. I was intrigued with the fact that FDA is kind of schism between food and drugs. Does your office handle food side too?
Not to a great extent. I mean, you know, we do. We have a. Steve is going to talk about communication that we have in the office. We definitely keep up with what's going on there and letting people know about it. We have a patient newsletter that goes out, and so we talk about food issues. Excuse me, especially things like the Food Safety Initiative. But we're much more involved in drugs and devices and biologics.
The second one is, I think, for the interest of all the patient groups, because FDA, as Dr. Sharfstein said, sometimes it's like a black box. Do you keep a kind of inventory or alerts of what opportunities are available for patients or patient groups to be involved in different platforms?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question. Steve Morin is going to talk about that later, but he spends a lot of time combing through the Federal Register, which is the daily newspaper of the federal government. He looks for all the opportunities for public input that are of interest to patients, and he posts it on a pretty much daily basis on the FDA website. And then in the biweekly newsletter that we put out, that is linked to the website to allow people to look at what's open for comment in the Federal Register and what public meetings are coming up where people are encouraged to come in and give their opinions and thoughts to FDA. And there was a question here. Yes.
Hi, I'm Andrea from SWHR. Thank you so much for your presentation, by the way. It was really helpful.
Oh, good.
My question was, you were talking about fast track and breakthrough drug applications. I was wondering how, kind of a rough estimate of what percentage of applications come in for these particular kind of priority reviews compared to standard regular reviews, I guess.
Well, it's mostly based on what the indication is, and if it's an indication where there's an unmet medical need or the sponsor can justify the fact that this is an improvement over an existing drug that is sort of meeting an unmet medical need, which might be ease of use, lower toxicity, more adherence to the regimen. But percentage-wise, I would say, I don't think I know what the percentage would be. I would say in certain areas like cancer, HIV, hepatitis, you know, really severe and serious illnesses and life-threatening illnesses, the proportion would be very high. But in things where you've got a lot of drugs on the market, blood pressure, things like that, headache, I would say it's got to be considerably lower. Yeah.
I have a two-part question. The first one has to do with drugs that are already used outside the U.S. For example, if they're already approved and they're being used in Europe, and then the manufacturer comes to FDA to get approval for use in the U.S., is all of that work and fact that the drug is already being used in other countries, does that come into play in FDA's approval? And then I have a second question that has to do with off-label use. So.
Okay, so for that first question, you might know that there's the, what is it called? It's the International Harmonization Committee. So Europe, Japan, US, I don't know if Australia is involved in that, Canada and Japan. wrench in Japan. But they're looking for ways to harmonize what the standards are, what are the requirements for approval. And for the most part, if a company comes in with foreign data, as long as it meets certain standards, which are generally the ethical conduct standards and quality of the clinical trial, and auditability, the agency needs to be able to go and audit the records for the trial. The agency accepts foreign-generated data. But simply being approved in another country is not enough of an argument, if you will. There are a lot of different regulatory models in different countries, and in Europe you can have products for rare diseases. I think it's called special circumstances or something, where you don't really have to show safety and efficacy, but if there's an unmet medical need for a rare disease, a drug can go on the market. We don't have that here. There still needs to be a demonstration that the drug is safe and effective. So, I think in Europe it's kind of a conditional approval, but, so things can meet market requirements in other countries that don't meet the standard for safety and effectiveness here.
And then the second question had to do with off-label use. And if a product's been used off-label for another therapy for many years, I guess I'm trying to figure out what is the advantage of the manufacturer from going back to FDA and starting the whole process over with getting approval for what is now that off-label use. And I'm just wondering, I mean, I'm in the infertility space, and so much of what happens in an IVF cycle is off-label use of medications. There's really only a couple of drugs that are actually approved for that. And the question always is there an advantage to the manufacturer? Because sometimes we think they're never going to go and take all that time to get FDA approval, just keep prescribing it off-label.
In my opinion, there are two advantages, and one is you can only promote your product based on what's in the label. So if you don't have an indication in the label, you can't promote it for that use, and you can't advertise it and say, this drug works for this. Okay. And that's a big advantage, to be able to advertise for your product for that particular use. And the other thing would be the fact that reimbursement. A lot of insurance companies and other third-party payers won't reimburse for a use that's off-label because it hasn't been shown to be safe and effective, at least not officially and sanctioned by a label. So I think both of them are related to the labeled indication, but those are the two advantages that I would see. But a lot of companies, people are using it, there's income coming in from it, and it would cost a lot of money to go ahead and do that. But I think also in some cases, you have a lot of evidence already that you can place toward your application. So it might be less intensive than taking a drug that's never been used for this use. Are there other questions? Yes?
I just want to sort of lead into the next panel.
Okay.
So you've been with the agency since 1970s?
Yeah, somewhere around
that.
there.
Started when you were 4.
Well, I was 5. But
So we move into the next speaker, which is the topic is on FDA and innovation. So given the time you've been with the agency, if you could choose one area of innovation that you feel like has advanced either the FDA or the work of the FDA forward since you've been there, what would that be?
I would say, without having a lot of time to really cogitate over it, I'd probably say accelerated approval. I think it made a tremendous difference. I think it was based in so much logic. I think it came about as a result pretty much of public pressure and input. And I think it really sort of laid the groundwork for a lot of other innovation to come from that kind of source, because people realized, here's people who have a really intense need, and they're so invested in it. They're thinking outside the box, and this was a terrific idea. So I think it kind of led the way to a lot of other innovation, and I think it opened the door to a lot of patient input, given the credibility of what people have to say based on their own needs. And with that, I thank you very much.